Good afternoon, everyone. We are so excited you're here. Thanks so much for joining us for Your Search is Over under the hood of Carnegie's Student Search. We're going to give folks just another minute or so. So grab that afternoon cup of coffee or Diet Coke or your lunch or West Coast folks, late morning snack, and we'll get started in just another minute as folks come on in to the webinar. And we'll sit in awkward silence in the meantime. All right. We're actually going to go on and get started. And so we've got a good folks are in, and so we're excited to get started. Welcome. My name is Trent Gilbert. I'm the Vice President of Student Search Solutions here at Carnegie. And thanks so much for joining us for our webinar today. Your search is over under the hood of Carnegie's Student Search. Before we begin, just want to do a quick audio check to make sure that everyone can hear us and the closed captioning is functioning properly. If a few folks would just raise their hand in the feature on Zoom, that would be great. Making sure everyone can hear. And awesome. Thank you for those folks that did that. I appreciate the 20 some odd of you all that followed directions this afternoon. So um, let us know in the chat if you need any assistance or troubleshoot anything. We're going to be using the Q&A feature within Zoom. So we have the webinar is designed to be about 45 minutes long, and then we'll save about 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So you can go on and submit those questions via the Q&A function in Zoom, and our staff is there to answer some of those questions as we go through, as well as we'll save some to answer at the very end. At the end of the webinar, check your inbox. We will give you a recording of the webinar that'll also provide access to all of this so you can come back and reference some of the incredible resources that are we're going to talk about today. And then we'd really appreciate it. We believe in this concept of just continuous optimization and improvement. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes at the end of all of this to complete our post-webinar survey, we would appreciate it. So without further ado, that is housekeeping, and we're going to go on and get started. And I'm excited to be joined by a couple of my colleagues, and I will hand it over to Jess and let her introduce herself, and then Jason, and then we'll get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Trent. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you all today. My name is Jess Siebert. I'm the VP of Enrollment Communications here at Carnegie. So I lead an incredible team of strategists who specialize in implementing communications, managing data and reports, and strategically helping our partner institutions meet their goals. I'm located just north of Indianapolis, Indiana. So hello to all fellow Hoosiers on this call or anyone who's from the Midwest. I am an alum of Ball State University, where I was lucky enough to help implement Slate and fall in love with it as a tool for enrollment communications. And I've been in Slate, working in Slate for about 8 years, and have a lot of hands-on experience with student search from both sides of the desk. So this is a very on-point topic to get me excited. So I'm really thrilled to chat with you all about search today. So I'll pass it over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Jess. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As Jess mentioned, we're really excited, and I hope that you'll be able to tell as we talk about these different topics how excited we are about them. This is our everyday. But as Trent mentioned, my name is Jason Frost. I'm VP of Enrollment Strategy at Carnegie. I manage the team of enrollment strategists who oversee many elements of recruitment strategy, and in particular, search-related strategy, but also aligning various strategies so that we're always working towards campus goals. I've spent the last almost 25 years now in higher education. The last 10 of those have been specializing in the role that search plays in overall enrollment strategy. And shout out to the West Coasters on the attendee list. I'm based in Bend, Oregon, however, grown and raised in Alaska. That's why that picture is there. So thanks again, and I'll hand it over to you, Trent.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason and Jess, and we're excited to hear your wisdom later on today. Again, folks, my name is Trent Gilbert. I'm the Vice President of Student Search Solutions here at Carnegie, and I've spent the past about 20 years in higher education and working with college and universities. and most recently spent some time as as a vice president for enrollment management. We're covering all the time zones, I think, today, just about, except for maybe Mountain. But I'm coming to you from Birmingham, Alabama, and so we're excited that you're joining us from all over. So just drop in the chat where you're from and where you're joining, and that way we can get some action happening in the chat, as well as don't forget, as we dive through this webinar, if you have questions, go on and put those in the Q&A. So without further ado, let's get under the hood. Let's pop the hood and let's talk a little bit about student search. And so when we think about student search at Carnegie, we really think of this as a yield-focused approach. And so what does that mean? I think oftentimes when institutions are thinking about yield, they're thinking about a yield campaign, or they're thinking about financial aid optimization. And those things are an important aspect of thinking about yield. But really, what if we actually began with the end in mind and had this moment where we actually are thinking about yield from the very moment that we start doing strategic lead sourcing? And then once we acquire names, once we get those students, once we understand who those students are, then we actually segment our communications. And then we have the ability to communicate with those students through a variety of different multi-channel campaigns, whether that's digital or email or print campaigns or call center campaigns or personalized video campaigns. And then all along this, it's not just, again, talking to students at the top of the funnel and or the beginning of their journey. It's about communicating with those students in these ways all the way through their entire experience. And then obviously along the way, it's about looking at the reporting that goes along with it. It's about really looking at like what is their level of engagement and providing some sort of scoring and metrics on there that ultimately drives yield strategy. And so we really look at this as this honeycomb approach to our work and to our philosophy as it relates to student search. So we're going to dive in. I'm going to hand things over to Jason, and we're going to talk about both the search strategy, and we're going to talk about the kind of the goals of your search strategy, behaviors, what's happening, some market specific strategies, and then we're going to talk about actually search management. This is where kind of I like to say the rubber meets the road, the implementation. How do we think about analyzation and optimizations along the way? So Jason, I will hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you, Trent. As Trent mentioned, we're going to dive into some nitty-gritty details here, but starting at a high level with institutional goals, looking at search resources, and then some search-specific goals. So with that, and some of this will be very fundamental, and as we work towards the end of the search strategy development portion of the webinar, we're going to get into some more kind of next level, some advanced search strategy. But regardless of the level of complexity, we feel you absolutely have to start with goals. And this is the first step in Carnegie's strategic lead sourcing that all of my team enrollment strategists are very familiar with. And when we say institutional goals, they tend to fall into one of two categories. Is the campus in a growth phase or a shaping phase? And so on the growth side of things, it might simply be we are enrollment and tuition-driven institutions, so we just are looking for headcount. Now, that's not to say there wouldn't be secondary or tertiary goals. Perhaps you're looking for some additional students in a particular major, or perhaps you have more room on campus and would prefer some more residential as opposed to commuter. We can absolutely develop strategy to work towards all of those goals. But on the shaping side of things, we might have a few additional questions, and it might be in setting goals around academic interest and majors. On the geographic side of things, perhaps it's, again, commuter versus residential, maybe urban versus rural, or even in-state versus out-of-state, working on some geographic diversity there. And then we also might talk about ability to pay or net tuition revenue, and whether we want to target perhaps one end of that spectrum or the other, and even talking about Pell eligibility and where does that land as far as net tuition revenue is concerned. So by listing out those goals and going through that prioritization exercise, we feel that we are setting things up for success with the search strategy. Now, the next step with that is looking at, well, how much influence does my search have relative to my overall campus enrollment goals? And this takes a little bit of a deep dive into the historical data you have in your CRM. You'll need to look at perhaps some origin source data, or if you have more robust tracking data in your CRM, really mapping out the student journey and looking at those touch points with search to determine, again, the influence of search on your overall enrollment. And then finally, at this stage, we need to take a look at the resources available and have those resources changed year over year. Has other resources that are search adjacent as far as some of the content that Jess is going to talk about? Has there been additional investment there? And then finally, we need to set some goals specific to search. So looking at some historical data, looking at those counts by stage and those historical conversion metrics. Not to say that those are going to be our end all be all as it relates to performance for these student search lists, but we need to have a benchmark. We need to have that bottom range perhaps that we use as that benchmark to potentially pivot on a search strategy. And finally, some engagement metrics, and Jess is going to go into a little bit more detail on those, but specific to platform and whether those email, print, SMS message, digital, whatever it may be. We need to have all of those data points in hand before we can really dive into the actual development of the search strategy. So with that, two things we're going to look and focus on in the strategy development portion or phase of all of this are student behaviors, and then some trends, and whether those are educational kind of higher ed landscape trends, maybe those are population trends, but behaviors and trends, that's how we typically are using, or what we're using to define markets. So I'm going to work in from left to right here. And I do want to reiterate that we are staying yield focused in every one of these markets that we're defining. We feel a yield focused approach. We're prioritizing it, affinity and enrollment, and we're getting away from the numbers game that is so often associated with student search. That's not, we feel, effective management of resources, and frankly, not the best use case for search. So painting in broad strokes, you'll see as you look at the list of markets here, and I'm going to use these terms core, historical, and expansion. You might use primary, secondary, tertiary, backyard, feeders, reach. They get at the same behavior set. And in part, these are very much driven by geography. Painting in broad strokes here again, we not just feel, we actually observe students that are living in similar neighborhoods. They attend similar schools. They're surrounded by similar populations or population settings, tend to exhibit similar behaviors when it comes to their own student search. And so that's an opportunity that we can lean into, that we can capitalize on. And so looking in an area close to campus, what I'm just going to call core, or maybe you might refer to this as your backyard. This is typically an area that is geographically in a close proximity to campus, where many institutions are collecting a large number of their applications, but not just their applications, they're enjoying a very high yield rate. Now, this core may not be perfectly defined by, say, a simple proximity ring, and depends on your campus setting, and it might be urban versus rural. Perhaps there's a mountain range or some other natural feature that maybe throws off that proximity. And then we talk a lot about perceived distance from campus, which often relates to drive time. What we find fascinating, and where there's a lot of opportunity within this core market, is that the proximity will often start to outweigh other factors for a student in their search process, particularly the later you get into the recruitment cycle. So that's our core market. Outside of that core market, we have very targeted geographies that you might call your feeder geographies that are consistently producing applications and enrollment. And these are often nurtured by strong alumni networks, sometimes high school counselor networks, and also student athletes come into play here with the historic markets. And depending on how much of your campus enrollment is represented by student athletes, you may choose to include them in your analysis, or potentially suppress them from your analysis and your identification of your feeder geographies. And then finally, looking at the expansion market. This is where we shift from observed student behavior, directly observed student behavior in your core and historical markets, to applying that same profile, geodemographic profile, maybe it's a culture around higher education, population profile, and applying that to areas where maybe the campus hasn't seen success yet. And kind of, to borrow a term from digital marketing, a lookalike geography. And so this is where, again, we shift from a directly observed student behavior into modeled student behavior. And these geographies, when we allocate resources appropriately, can be very productive. However, they are the ones where we need to apply the most scrutiny, not just with data and quantitative elements, but also some qualitative elements, asking ourselves as admissions professionals, is this zip code, geomarket, DMA a viable expansion market for the campus? So let's dive even deeper now, and let's look at some step-by-step method, if you will, and how one of our enrollment strategists might go about designating this. Again, starting with the core, we're going to work our way through expansion. The core is at that fundamental level, and those expansion markets and geographies definitely take some additional data and, again, some additional scrutiny. But with the core, there certainly are opportunities for statistical analysis here, and really it boils down to a change point analysis in particular. However, oftentimes a visual analysis, just like we've got up on screen here, and this is actual data from a campus. You'll see some details here as we get into some of these maps. But this visual analysis, utilizing some distance cohorts, we can very quickly come to a relatively similar result as we might the change point analysis, in that we see a strong application conversion rate, a consistent admit rate. But when you look at the yield rate for that closest proximity cohort, you can see we have a significantly higher yield rate. And we see this even at universities with a very strong national brand. You still will often see that higher yield rate. Now, it may not be double that of the next distance cohort, but we do typically see an increase in that yield rate. So again, a visual analysis is a great place to start. We utilize mapping tools for some confirmation once we've started to hone in on these sweet spots. And so diving into that, on the left, and we're really getting into the details here, so bear with me. I'll try to keep moving at a quick pace. But on the left, you'll see a historical deposit map or heat map for historical deposits, along with that 50-mile proximity ring. Now, I'm guessing some of you who know this region are already seeing, some skew as far as the geographic representation. It's not a perfect representation from border to border. And if you're familiar with this particular region, I-65 and I-40 are really representing some of the major outer bounds, if you will, of the student behavior set. And on the right, you can see exactly that. That's a 1-hour drive time ring or layer that's been overlaid on top of that heat map. So confirming perhaps what some of your admission staff might already have hunches about. And it's not just straight distance from campus, but you're working around perceived distance from campus. So whether it is a drive time, and there are tools available online, and we use some very specific mapping software to accomplish this, but maybe it's a proximity ring, maybe it's a drive time, or a hybrid of the two. For this particular campus, you can see on the next slide here that they ended up going with just that 50-mile proximity ring. They felt they had some opportunities with those students who were just outside of that 1-hour drive time from campus. So I realize I went pretty quickly, but that is our step-by-step as far as establishing a core or backyard market. Transitioning to the historical market, again, you might call these your feeder geographies. This is an area outside of your core, but where you are landing consistent application and enrollments over the period of the last few years. And you can pull this data for this definition from your CRM. At Carnegie, we have something called the Market Opportunity Index, which also quickly pulls this and is custom to every institution. But what we want to be looking at is usually at the zip code level, and there's some nuance with zip codes depending on the part of the country that you're in, but we tend to stick to zip codes, and looking at those very primary funnel metrics and funnel stage counts, so that we might say, well, in the core, on average, per zip code, we're landing 10 deposits year to year. So as far as feeder geographies outside of the core, maybe I'll use 5 deposits there, or a combination of at least 10 admits and 5 deposits. So once you've established that criteria, it's very easy then to assign those zip codes as your historical or your feeder market. And so for our example institution, this is what it looks like. And in purple, you can see the historic or feeder markets, and it looks very scattered. But remember, this is observed student behavior. This is where you already have established pipeline in this particular markets. And this institution I'm using as an example is really looking to stay regional, and that they're just, of course, working in their home state of Tennessee, but also the contiguous states, not really extending much further past that. So then when it's time to look at expansion, this is where it gets a little bit more complex, and you might call this a reach market. But this is where we take your historical success and we proxy it out to new regions across the United States. And I'm showing you a little snippet here, again, of that Market Opportunity Index. It provides several indices, and depending on your institutional goals, we may weight those differently, but we're looking generally at that overall opportunity score. What this does, and what you could do on your campus, would be to tap into publicly available data sets, whether it's census or American Community Survey data, IPEDS and NCES data. If you are in a region that is currently or will be significantly impacted by the enrollment cliff, then I definitely encourage you to go look at the WICHE reports. Of course, if you're working at the zip code or county level, there's data available from the USPS. We also look to incorporate data from the BLS. So lots of publicly available data that you can use to start to profile specific zip codes, geomarkets, DMAs, what have you. But what we are looking to do is to hone in on these lookalike geographies where you've had success in the feeder or in your core, and identifying new geographies that are very closely aligned with that. Again, back to the comment I made earlier about students who are being raised or living in similar areas tend to exhibit similar behaviors, at least as it relates to student search. They don't start to differentiate from that until they leave that particular geography and they head off to college. So looking at what this looks like at the map, you can see in orange, again, a very scattered approach. And this is where we are taking that observed behavior and we are applying it into a modeled behavior set. Bringing that all together, this is the geographic representation of this composite geography. Now, we may choose to add in some additional layers later, and this is kind of the most fundamental approach to how we would look to build geographic strategy. But in a moment, we'll talk about how we review and how we might do some testing of this particular composite geography. And actually, it's a perfect segue. So I'll touch briefly on market review and also supplementing the geography if you have some very specific initiatives on campus that you need to work towards via search strategy. And then we're going to get into quickly developing specific search markets, or search strategies rather, by market, because each of those three that we've looked at represent a different behavior set. Those different behavior sets require a slightly different parameter set as it relates to list acquisition. So diving into that, at this point, after someone on the enrollment strategy has built the base layer as far as strategy is concerned, we like to test this proposed strategy against historical data. In other words, let's say this institution is in that growth phase. We want to make sure that our proposed strategy wouldn't have left any historic enrollment on the table, if you will. So if we jump straight to that right-hand column, the percent of total enrollment, this particular strategy, because this institution has such very strong historical markets, is capturing all of the historical enrollment. And then in the expansion, not capturing any of the historical enrollment, which is by design, and we'll be leaning into that expansion markets to try to build out future feeder markets. But this is also where I check myself and make sure, are these search strategies working towards our institutional goal? In this case, it's all about enrollment. But we did, in this particular situation, have a secondary goal, and that is to increase some geographic diversity out of state versus in state. And we're doing just that. We're incorporating those neighboring states as well. If you have some scholarships that are geography specific, maybe it's neighboring counties, perhaps you offer scholarships to some neighboring states, this is where we would layer in, layers 4, 5, 6, the list goes on and on, as far as additional search markets or geographies that are working specifically towards those scholarships. But for the sake of keeping me on time, I'm just going to stick to these 3 for now. So looking at some market-specific strategies, and I'm going to be working again from left to right here, and want to reiterate, these each represent a slightly different student behavior set. And because of that, we need to utilize some very market-specific parameters. Now, as far as the levers that we have to work with, the primary lever being geography, and it's one of the easier levers to work with. But after that, we need to layer in some student level data to really bump up the likelihood that we are engaging with a student population likely to apply and enroll. Again, that yield focused search. So within that core market, and as far as academic interest is concerned, I encourage you to be very, very flexible here. I mentioned earlier, this is the market where proximity easily starts to outweigh other factors. And in particular, academic major. Definitely include undecided students here. These students will likely convert. So don't worry about having a perfect match with the list of majors offered by your campus. When it comes to score bands and GPA bands, this is also your best opportunity to enroll high profile students, those high performing or top tier academic students. So be a little ambitious here. If you don't necessarily enroll every 1600 SAT score, this might be the place where I still actually include a score band up to 1600. Proximity may start to outweigh those scores and just that perceived mobility of that particular student. And then as far as sources are concerned, this is the area that I'm looking to include quite a few different sources. I'm looking to have full market coverage. And in order to do that, I really have to accommodate sources for every student profile and student journey if you have that data. So whether it's testing versus non-testing, this is where I'm also, if it aligns with your admission standards, to bring in non-assessed students, or working with not just your prospect sources, but also direct leads sources like Carnegie's lead gen service, or even College Board interest in my college. This is a great place to utilize those. Moving over one category into the historical now, this is where we start to ratchet down the parameters. And so on the academic interest side of things, sometimes I'm pulling undecided out of the mix. I'm looking for more students who are have that direct match or academic interest. On the score bands and GPA, I'm typically pulling down the top and I'm bumping up the bottom of the range and trying to, in some ways, utilize test scores to proxy mobility, and also finding a little bit of that sweet spot as far as overall student ability. looking at sources, the great thing about our feeder markets or historical markets is that they tend to be very targeted. So I can typically include multiple sources here, making sure that I'm continuing to nurture these feeder geographies by using multiple sources. Jumping over to expansion, I'm sure you guessed it. This is where I get the most restrictive, where I'm ratcheting down the parameters even further, oftentimes using just those majors that are known to convert the best, especially far from campus. But if you have a niche academic major, this is when we really lean into that. Similar to historical, on the score bands and GPA, I'm pulling down the top end and bumping up the bottom end even further to get a real narrow score and GPA band there, trying to hone in on that sweet spot, especially from students further from campus. And then sources, sometimes I'm limiting this just to one, sometimes two, but really the top performing sources, always looking to acknowledge if there is a dominant source in that particular region that we're primarily working in with these reach markets. So I hope that helps in the illustration, kind of moving from least restrictive over to the right and most restrictive, and that aligns with proximity from campus. And so the screenshot below really pulls that all together and doesn't look like much, but this incorporates the 3 geographic markets that we just discussed. This incorporates the market specific search list parameters and from academic interest to score, GPA band, and then a few additional groups there, assessed versus non-assessed. But this is the point once we start framing out what would a list strategy look like. I will often take a handful of student profiles, usually student workers who are willing to share the information, and with their home address when they were in high school and their score and GPA bands and major of interest. And I do some use testing. Would those students have been picked up in this strategy? Yes or no? And if yes, is that where we're going with our institutional goals? Same question if no. Just to make sure as a final check that the strategy that we just developed, all the way from the market development and these search or market specific parameters are in alignment with the institutional goals that we talked about at the very beginning of this process. And finally, a little bit of a consideration here regarding the cohort and senior versus underclassmen. We just don't have much runway to work with seniors. And so as a result, I will often make a senior specific expansion market where we tighten up those parameters even further. And on the underclassmen side of things, I might open up those parameters a little bit, knowing I just have much more time to initiate, engage, and nurture a relationship with those students relative to a senior in high school. All right. That is a perfect transition. I'm going to hand things over to Jess to talk a little bit about now that we have the strategy developed, how do we implement and then manage the search and communication campaigns. Thanks, Jess.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. That was awesome. So informative. And I'm excited to kind of leapfrog off of that into talking more about the next phase of Carnegie's approach to search, which is actually implementing it. Before I dive too deep here, I also want to remind you all to add any questions or comments that you may have through the chat functionality or the Q&A feature. We're monitoring that and can answer questions, and we'll have some time at the end to answer questions as well. So just wanted to plug that one more time before I really dive in here to implementing search strategy and implementing the strategy that kind of Jason really set the stage for, but implementing that through thoughtful and effective campaigns takes a lot of planning. It takes strategic alignment, and it also takes technical know-how. And there's really no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to building and executing multi-channel search campaigns. But I want to take time to walk through key components of this phase from our perspective, including learnings and best practices that we live by here at Carnegie when working on search campaigns. So we'll start out a little bit philosophical, I guess you could say. There are ideal students out there. Jason just talked about it. There are ideal students out there, and there are ways to reach and target those ideal students. And we've identified those through establishing the search strategies that Jason just walked through. Now we need to connect with these ideal students in an authentic way, a personal way, and a consistent manner. So we need to think through before we start writing our copy and designing our things, what should that connection look like? And who are these ideal students we're speaking to, and how can we most effectively connect to those students? So I think of this in kind of three different buckets. The first is brand and voice. So think of this as kind of the what we're communicating to students. You'll see here, I have an example of an ideal student here that you'll see here, they get competing content from schools constantly. They're getting their attention will require a brand story that's distinctive, emotive, speaks to their core values and their interests. So to reach this student, brand and voice is extremely important. And not just having the brand and voice, but applying that effectively to campaign messaging and imagery as well is really important to connecting to ideal students like this one. So ensuring consistent brand and voice is established before we jump into actually creating the campaigns is crucial. Next is channel and timing. Think of this as the where and the when. So this student, they're an ideal student, they've applied, we know their communication preferences, and now it's essential for us to cultivate this lead to deposit with an optimized channel strategy. For us here at Carnegie, multi-channel is best. Really thinking through the different mediums and platforms to reach students and using historical data to not just go out there on all the channels possible, but intentionally thinking through the mix of channels that will work best for your ideal students. The timing piece here is also crucial. Learning how your students, when your students want to be communicated with, per each channel and per stage in their search journey is something to think about as part of your connection strategy ahead of time as well. The last piece here, maybe my favorite, personalization. We'll call that the how here. How are we communicating to these students? So this student here, they're an ideal student motivated by ideas like achievement, strength, results, but colleges don't know this about this student, so they continue to send generic messaging instead of personalized communication speaking to their motivations. One thing I think we all can agree upon is that Gen Z requires personalized communications, but let's think beyond taking the student's first name and sticking that in the subject line. At Carnegie, we actually help institutions develop psychographic segmentation strategies that are custom to them, which when those are applied to prospective student populations, that allows us to personalize communications for students based on their motivations rather than geographic demographic data. This is an in-depth approach to communication, and this strategy allows us to really meet ideal students like this one, where they need to be met with communication that engages them in a super personalized way. So, connection strategy, huge piece of this. Definitely spend time really thinking here before we even move on to thinking about kind of a vision for how we want to timeline out search. That's our next step that I'll show as well. So as we're moving on to timeline planning, this is kind of an example of that search isn't just emails. It's not just lead sourcing. It's layered efforts that last throughout the cycle. And yes, they even overlap each cycle. Search is a never-ending cycle of things to do and think about. And because of this, it's really important to get our teams on the same page of what's happening, when it's happening, what overlaps, what connects with each other. And this isn't just an example of a high-level timeline of search efforts. And you'll see here, we're even including visits. We're including digital outreach. We're including yield and anti-melt efforts as well to really get a full picture of our ideal plan in timeline form. So this is something that we consider a crucial step in our Carnegie search approach. And we have expert team members who, from both strategic and project management lenses, build out these timelines, monitor them throughout the project, and we know that there'll be tweaks along the way. So ensuring those are monitored and kept up to date as well. So I encourage you all to step away from this and build a timeline with your team as well, whether it's in a project management tool that you have or just on a whiteboard or with a pen and paper. It's really important to visually see everything working together before you dive into your content creation.
And
But
also
even
just
before, oh yeah, go ahead.
sorry, Jess. Just a quick nod to everyone in the attendee list here. Admissions is difficult, right? I mean, just
Oh
look at
yeah,
this calendar. I mean, it was overwhelming just to make this slide, right? But actually
right.
doing all of this. So my hat is off to everyone doing all of these and making all of these efforts happen on campus. It's a lot. And I think back to what search looked like 10, 15 years ago. It was a simpler beast back then.
It certainly was, which means it's even more and more important to make sure that things are organized up front like this and laid out so everyone has an idea of the plan moving forward. So thanks for that, Jason. That's helpful. So even before we get into content development as well, we really want to think a little bit more specifically. So once this big general timeline is ready to roll, the next step for us is we're diving into creating a multi-channel communications plan, which allows us the chance to fully outline every single outreach point, which includes timing and topic details and really viewing the holistic content strategy before we dive into content creation. So think of the slide right before this, think of that timeline as kind of your vision for search, and think of the communications plan truly as your action plan. So if you all dive into creating a communications plan, a couple of things I recommend you think about, including in this plan, include the names of your different outreach pieces, send dates, or drip days. I highly recommend whenever you can, setting your campaigns on drip cadences so students can continually receive that communication throughout the year, regardless of when those names are purchased through lead sourcing strategy. Include topic information, call to action information about segmentation and personalization, format, medium, a column for any needed links and content. This serves as one, a great way to visualize the strategy, but also a great way to keep track of the information you don't have that you need, maybe you do have, ideas you have, and also ensure you're thinking about all formats and mediums here. That could include print, email, texting, digital advertising. Just really ensure your flow of information and content for all platforms connect. It remains consistent, speaks back to your brand and your voice at the end of the day. So you're really having a connected connection strategy. Truly everything works together in that way, and using these tools helps us keep those things connected. So we've got our vision, we've got our action plan. So let's go ahead and take some action. We need to create content that reflects our communications plan, embodies our connection strategy, which of course is easier said than done, right? There's a lot of things that we've already thought through, and we need to kind of boil that down all into individual pieces of content. So one tool that we use here at Carnegie to help us get to that point of effective personalized content based on everything we've already strategized is what we call a content outline, which you'll see an example of on the screen here. This kind of document outlines the content that we see for each outreach, includes important information, especially on psychographic segmentation pieces that we plan to incorporate in each message. So you'll see in this example here, we're actually creating a few different versions of the same email with segmented visuals and copy for our different psychographic segments to be able to serve them content that will uniquely motivate them. So this particular institution that we're looking at here has a segment that we call the open-minded adventurer. And I know it's a little small here, but you can see that the header imagery here shows students hiking and the little tagline of trailblazers, while our our email that's really targeting students in our self-disciplined achievers segment has a header showing students working in a lab with the tagline boundary pushers. So this really illustrates the concept of unique content for unique students. And this is a massive differentiator for students when they're being served so much content from so many institutions, not just in their email inboxes, but in their physical mailing inboxes through digital advertising. Really serving them the unique content that speaks to their motivations is a huge difference maker, and it really helps institutions stand out in that way. So I want to show another example of this. Unique content for unique students, but this time we're looking at a postcard. So you can see here two versions of the same postcard. One is catered towards students who are motivated by creativity and exploration. And the other one on the bottom is motivated or catered towards students who are motivated by strength, tenacity, grit. This really is the power of a personalized connection strategy utilizing psychographic segmentation. So I want to highlight one more piece of content that I believe is super key to search efforts. because of course our biggest goal in search campaigns is to enroll students at the end of the day and see them graduate. But the main call to action in most of our search campaigns is for students to raise their hand and inquire. So that requires an engaging, personalized place for students to be able to raise their hands and inquire. So this is what we call a search landing page here at Carnegie. Really, mainly it's a place to inquire, but as you can see, there's also more information. It's also a place to explore and to learn more. So our Carnegie search landing pages are built and tested by our professional front-end strategists, and it truly is a key part of our search strategy. So definitely encourage you all to think about not just the communications you're sending out, but where you're sending students to fulfill that call to action, to raise their hand, to say that they're interested in inquiring at your institution. Okay, so we're nearly at the finish line, right? We just need to get this campaign launched and off the ground. So when it comes to email campaigns, our tool of choice here at Carnegie is Technolution Slate, but most any CRM can support search outreach efforts. We just love Slate because it really can be molded to support an institution's unique needs from a data management and outreach perspective, but know that at Carnegie, we can also support institutions in their search efforts regardless of what CRM they currently have. Truly, at the end of the day, it really just is of utmost importance to us here at Carnegie that we are providing fully transparent, secure, and real-time data and reporting to our partner institutions. So just a bit of advice for everyone on this call as you think about your search strategy, think about the deployment tool and method that works best for you and any outside assistance that you might need as well. What's important to you all? Is transparency and data ownership really important to you? Then maybe an insourcing approach utilizing your own institutional CRM may be best. Do you want to prioritize more of a hands-off experience? Consider that as well. There's really no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to deployment and tools and support for deployment. So know that we're always available here at Carnegie just to chat through our experience, the best practices that we've learned, and what might be right for your institution. We're always happy to chat through different approaches, pros and cons. Just let us know. Happy to chat. All right. So remember when I said that we were nearly at the finish line? I was kidding, because the real fun has just begun. This is my favorite part, at least. We now get to monitor our running campaigns and keep an eye on key metrics and trends, and then assess any pivots and optimizations needed to ensure peak performance as well. So we do this ultimately through real-time performance reporting. So let's start by talking about key metrics here. So as you can probably tell, I love reports. I love them a lot. There's so much data that we can sift through when it comes to search efforts, but I'm sure many of you experience this as well. Some data is more meaningful than other data. So I want to talk through some groups of key metrics that we consider important here at Carnegie when it comes to monitoring search campaigns and assessing success as well. So first, as we're thinking about the campaign itself, let's think about these metrics in two different buckets. How are students interacting with the campaign itself? Clicks, opens, opt-outs. But also, how are students interacting with the campaign in accordance with the call to action? So that's the difference really between campaign engagement and campaign conversions. We also really emphasize the need to report on lead sourcing conversion as well. We can really layer in breakouts for market, academic profiles, purchase dates, many more things. And the real-time tracking here can help us inform lead sourcing strategy throughout the cycle. As we know, it's not just a one and done kind of thing. So having this to look back on throughout the year is really important. Overall funnel reporting is another additional tool that is really important when looking at search campaign performance, especially when we're assessing progress to goals. I also wanted to mention here a tool that we rely on here at Carnegie that allows us to have an even deeper understanding of student behavior that we utilize to layer into our reports as well. So our engagement scoring product is called Engage, and it combines our expertise in Slate with quantitative modeling. So the scores aren't just numbers or just generic recommendations. They're really data-backed and ready to help with both detailed decision-making and big picture decision-making as well. So those data points we layer in our reports often as well. These last two buckets of metrics here can also help us answer the question of kind of, so what? We have tons of data with tons of metrics, but how does that compare and what do those numbers mean? We can look at year-over-year metrics to compare to our own efforts year over year. And at Carnegie, we also lean really heavily on benchmarking metrics. And we inform our partner institutions regularly how their efforts are performing compared to like institutions. So having context for your own institution and context for other institutions similar to you is really helpful when we're kind of making meaning of these numbers and this data. So where are we building these reports? As you can see on the right, we built something called our Carnegie Communications Dashboard. It's kind of a one-stop shop dashboard that holds a bunch of different reports in one spot. And I'll pop to the next screen just to kind of show you a little recording of a live report here. It's an example of one of our dashboards. You can see it holds information about conversions, form submissions, individual email engagement. We also know that a pretty dashboard truly is only good as the people monitoring these dashboards as well. So I also want to take just a couple of minutes to chat through Carnegie's best practices and approaches when it comes to monitoring campaigns for potential pivots and optimizations. So search campaigns, I've said it several times, but they shouldn't be set it and forget it. And we need to remain flexible to react to campaign performance and to things happening in our campuses and around the world. So real-time reporting can help us identify what pivots need to be made, but think about these questions when you're talking about kind of your approach to making pivots. What metrics may indicate a pivot is needed? What kind of pivots would affect our progress to goals? And should we make a change to the active campaign or supplement with additional efforts? Sometimes it really makes sense just to add instead of change. So when our teams monitor campaigns and assess pivots or recommendations, here are some of our common things that we're looking at. You can see A/B testing. So we're testing a couple different versions of the same message, adjusting call to action language or button placement, adjusting subject lines, pre-header text, but also some of our supplemental efforts that we're often working through or recommending. Ad hoc supplemental emails or text messages to really respond to the performance of the campaign, or other supplemental efforts beyond just planned campaign outreach. So think about outreach call lists based on responders, or any pivots or tweaks to your events or recruitment structure that you have learned from the live campaign itself. So those are just some ideas and some ways to think about pivots and optimizations. I do want to make sure we have time for some questions here. So I'm actually going to pass it over to Trent to wrap it up with kind of our end goal and move into a couple of minutes of questions and answers.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess, and thanks, Jason. So, for us, when we really think about strategic lead sourcing, or we think about student search, really it starts with strategic lead sourcing and it goes all the way through all these different components that we've talked about. And really, at the end of the day, though, for us, it's about getting the student to not just enroll, but also to graduate. And so, like, our North Star at Carnegie is really, it's not just about getting a student to raise their hand. It's about getting the student to enroll and ultimately graduate from the institution. And I think if we think about that, recognizing that the revenue that comes along with it for our institutions is tied to that, that really should be all of our goals as enrollment managers at the beginning of all this. So thank you so much for Jess and Jason for your all's time. Before we get to questions, I do want to share one quick little bit of resources. And so these are a couple of resources. When you get the slide deck, you'll get these. I think our team is going to drop these in the chat, but I do want to draw your attention to a couple of them. First is Carnegie hosts a really robust blog that covers everything from topics on enrollment and branding and digital marketing, student success, and institutional planning. So I encourage you to go check out the blog that we have in there. We also have a bunch of recorded webinars, so you can actually view other past content as well as future content. I'd also encourage you, if you're a podcaster, put your earbuds in. There's a great, hosted by a really great person, myself. There's a great Pulse Check podcast that I had an opportunity to really talk about the future of student search earlier this fall, and really had a great opportunity to do that. So you can check that out via the link here or on your favorite podcast platforms. And of course, we'd love to partner with you. If you have questions, if you want to partner with us, we'd love to engage you in conversation. So let's get to some questions. So Jess, this one I think is going to be for you. Do you have any recommendations to tagging these zip codes in Slate so the reports could be built by these three market types. I think really kind of tying in the concept that Jason was talking about with zip codes and kind of putting that into practice. So I wonder if you had an opportunity to maybe address that for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Our best practice approach is to, when we're thinking about Slate, but also can apply to other CRMs as well, is to create a custom field for markets and to build this out within a query library, essentially. Which, if you're not familiar with Slate, what a query library is it essentially is a shortcut to a query, essentially. So within the query library, we can establish and say, okay, this is going to be a subquery export that's pulling all of the zip codes for our core market. And we can continue to use that query in reports, in other queries, really in anything as we're moving through. And we can also adjust that query library if our market definitions ever do change. So it's just a way for us to be flexible to avoid having to create custom fields and really leaning on the query libraries tool.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. There's a lot of dialogue, a lot of great conversation and questions that happen. But one thing I do want to really kind of draw attention to is really the interconnectedness of all of this, right? You can source the best names, but without having the right communication strategy to connect with those students, it doesn't matter. You can have the best communications possible, but without having the right lead sourcing strategy, it doesn't matter. You can do all of that, but if you're not following up with yield strategies in terms of financial aid optimization and how you're tracking engagement in the process, it doesn't matter. You're not going to have as much of an impact. So really, if we want to focus, we need to focus on an entire overarching integrated student search approach. And that includes, right, having a strong brand and being able to communicate in our brand voice. That includes thinking about resonating. How are we segmenting psychographics and getting into the actual segmentation? We have the capability of helping our clients do this each and every day via their Slate instance. And those folks that may not have a Slate instance, we actually have the capability of doing that as well via a Carnegie hosted Slate instance that we have as part of that efforts as well. So again, thanks so much for coming under the hood of the Carnegie Student Search today. Appreciate it. Great questions, great dialogue. We will be sending out a recording of this to you, as well as a post-webinar survey that we'd love for you to submit so we can continue to optimize our work and bring to you great content that answers questions that are your most complex questions. So thanks so much. Looking forward to connecting with many of you in the coming days, and have a great rest of the week. Thanks so much for joining us.